All right. Thank you so much for joining me today. And the topic for this presentation will be just Native women and the fact that they have gone missing or murdered. And it's a public health issue that's definitely an emerging issue. I really enjoyed doing this presentation and this project as a whole and conversing with my group mates. And so let's get right into it. So my role for this particular presentation was to be a policy specialist, and I really enjoyed that aspect of this presentation and this project because it really gave me an opportunity to see what's the existing policies that are in place, um, and if they've been effective since they've been implemented. And while I found that there are policies in place and that the United States is trying to do its best to really address this issue, there are clearly aspects of it that really need to be revamped and challenged. Um, and so let's just get into our problem statement. So the problem is that we have so many Native women are going missing and ultimately found dead. And there has been not as much public pressure or a public eye on what's happening, especially in these rural regions. And so for the sake of this presentation, we wanted to look at that, look at, well, why is that happening? What's causing that? And what are some ways that we can help address this issue? I know some of the things that I found is that some families feel disconnected and actually looked down upon because this issue has been going on for so long, and there's been limited um, public pressure, social media attention on the issue. What are some risk factors that um, find these women in these different scenarios? One of them is that intimate partner violence, and that'll come up later in the presentation, but that's a major risk factor and component of this as well. You find that majority of the women that end up missing or murdered are in circumstances that already they're showing signs of that violence, whether physical, emotional abuse. So there's a history there. Some additional risk factors include institutional racism and racial misclassification. And I found that quite interesting because it in the misclassification, you find that they would actually be classified as other ethnic groups. And so what will happen is that a lot of the reporting and understanding of the depth of the issue it would be missed. There would be no understanding of that. And so that's another risk and issue that definitely needs to be addressed. And then some other additional risk factors include alcohol and drug use. Um, in most of the cases that are found in case studies, it appears that alcohol and drug use were a component of the home, and of the family, and even family history as well. Let's keep going here. So our social ecological model was pretty in depth. So I'm going to go through each level, and then we'll move on from there. But on an individual level, we'll start there. It really starts with the history of these women and the fact that they've been targeted for a very long time. And so a lot of times what I found in my research is that these young Native women have actually experienced violence at such a young age, and it just continues throughout their lives. And that's on the individual level. On the interpersonal level, the family interpersonal relationships, or family and interpersonal relationships, is another aspect of where it would be seen, but rarely would they report these things. So there's a reporting issue when it comes to the interpersonal level. And a lot of that has to do with the cultural and tribal expectations and beliefs behind, if there's an issue that occurs, how should it be addressed? And also, colonization has made it very difficult for this group of people to really be trusting of outside support, so that on an interpersonal level, they try to deal with things and manage things on their own, but oftentimes, you know, these women are still experiencing violence. Organizationally, we find that supportive services are really lacking. Now, that has definitely changed over time, but they're still lacking, especially in supports around intimate partner violence, which I've talked about that before. Um, and there's a statistic here that even says that Native women experience intimate partner violence about 37% of the time. That's pretty significant. And the hope on that level when dealing with organizations is that we can increase the resources and supports around these individuals and their families. So that means advocacy hotlines and programs, legal support, housing, and health services. On a community level, that includes things like tribal health departments, local health departments, and when you have the state departments interacting with those on the community level. And again, a lot of this is sort of this ingrained mistrust of these institutions. And quite frankly, they want to be able to handle and deal with the challenges on their own through their own avenues and supports and services. So the tribal health department would be a crucial key stakeholder. And then on a policy level, and I've spoken about this before, the Violence Against Women's Act was really one of the first acts that really and policies that address violence against women, especially Native women, and began that process of inclusion on the policy level to address these issues, especially regarding the violence, the missing, the murdered population. And what we found is that, and this is quite troubling, was that in the initial policy, Native American women were actually left out of the language of it. And so through different reauthorizations over the years, they've been able to add the right wording and the correct wording and labeling to include this group of people. Some proposed interventions. Now these I really had, they were really fun when I came up with these, but I have three that I want to discuss. The home visiting program, intimate partner violence and community empowerment training, and then the tribal safe havens. The home visiting program really comes from my experience of working in the community and going into homes, but I found that you really learn and gather a lot of information from a person or from a family when you see them in their own environment. So the focus would be on, in this particular setting, assisting those families that are maybe experiencing or at risk of experiencing intimate partner violence or at risk of going missing. And what would it include? It would include safe pregnancy tools and screenings, childhood interventions, and assess for safety concerns, including abuse, neglect, and malnutrition. Now, the second one here is a training, and that training would coincide with the program. So if you're part of the home visiting program, we would set you up with the training, and the event would take place, and it would really focus on things like warning signs, safety tips, and prevention and emergent responses to those individuals who may be at risk of going missing or intimate partner violence. And then the last one is the tribal safe havens, very similar to women's shelters, but it would have a tribal component to it where they will really feel supported and have those resources to make sure that they can still stay safely in their communities. Some ways that we would evaluate this is through surveys and the outcomes of those surveys. Also utilizing qualitative research design. So conducting interviews with the participants in the program to understand how well is it going, have they benefited from it, are there any challenges or barriers? And then for the training program, we would do a pre and post test. regarding the material that we would cover in that training program. Some challenges that I found include cultural and tribal laws and competence around these things. So really understanding the individuals that you're working with and their families. One thing I learned was that, Native women are actually the heads of their home and they're the major decision makers. So really understanding that when you go into working with these individuals and their families in their settings. Improving upon already established policy, funding sources, and empowerment instead of control, because there's already been issues of, the past history around colonization. And so you really want to empower them to be able to build themselves up and to take care of business for themselves. And then addressing the mistrust of state and federal officials. Here's our logic model. And the logic model really just talks about how we would go about those different programs that we have, those 3 programs that we discussed, and how we would need staffing, funding, some resource guide and tools and assessment tools and ways to record keep those who are involved, what's happening, and then the short-term and long-term outcomes of these programs. Thank you so much. And this has been my presentation. All right, take care. Bye-bye.